There's video of Tim Walz doing the exact same thing.
Right.
Exact same thing, and
Yes.
he said, of course, it's a Nazi salute. He said that.
Right.
We spent 3 days debating, having them trying to debate.
I'm going to make note of this. You are not getting off the hook at the next election if you vote no on this. You are not getting off the hook about us coming out there and making the case that 92% of people, and I don't even care in the most conservative of districts, it's well over 60% of people know this.
Why did a moment that should have faded away quietly suddenly feel like it never should have happened in the first place? Because something slipped through, and once you see it, you can't ignore it. What came next wasn't yelling or showmanship. It was a calm, almost offhand breakdown that made the room tense in a very uncomfortable way. Joe Rogan and Megyn Kelly didn't go straight at Tim Walz. They moved around him, pressed where it hurt, and let the pauses do the real work. And that's when things turned awkward in a way no one was ready to talk about.
So I'm looking forward to CNN's apology to Nick Shirley, because Tim Walz just ended his campaign for re-election as Minnesota governor because of this cumulative reporting.
Now we hear more political rhetoric. Enough. Enough is enough. And so to Minnesotans, don't take the bait. Do not take the bait. Do not allow them to deploy federal troops into here. Do not allow them to invoke the insurrection.
Before we keep going, hit that like button and subscribe, because you already know you don't want to miss what's coming next. This moment didn't show up with alarms or flashing lights, and that's exactly why it landed so hard. It slipped in quietly, looking like just another political chat. The kind people think they're listening to while they're really scrolling past it.
Seen that? No. The video of him taking down the Minnesota flag and he replaced it with the new flag that looks a lot like the Somali flag. Minnesota has a huge population of Somalis in it.
Oh, wait a minute.
So he gets the flag, picks it up, moves it out of the way, and replaces it. Look at this.
There, that's better.
Why is that better? We're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars that were going somewhere. So people were profiting, people had jobs, and they want to keep all those jobs.
Do you have any doubt that Tim Walz knew about this fraud as it was occurring?
They want to keep that money flowing, even the bullshit money, as much as they can. Court orders, and there's lawsuits. So
Then, all of a sudden, the mood shifted. Not because anyone got louder, but because something uncomfortable was finally said out loud. And that was the mistake. Comfort is the real currency in modern politics. And Tim Walz's comfort zone took a direct hit without anyone even pretending it was accidental.
Minnesota are not going particularly well. Tim Walz has announced he's not going to run for re-election. And now we're learning, and DHS has swarmed 2,000 agents into Minneapolis to try to find out what's happening at these daycare centers and elsewhere, whether and how bad the fraud is. And then our pal Rich McHugh over at News Nation was just calling attention to this morning.
Joe Rogan and Megyn Kelly didn't come in throwing punches. That would have been too obvious, too predictable, and way too easy to brush off as noise. Instead, they did something much more unsettling. They treated Walz like a serious figure, someone whose words and actions actually mattered, and that alone was enough to create trouble.
politicians are being pressured to try to keep a lot of the spending.
Walz and Ellison were protecting fraudsters instead of investigating them. No coincidence that this is occurring largely in the Somali community.
Because a lot of the spending is all shenanigans. It's moving around to thousands of different NGOs.
Walz made a sanctuary state. He gave free healthcare, free college, and free licenses to illegals. And Walz looked the other way when Somali immigrants.
When you stop laughing out of politeness and start connecting the dots, the whole performance begins to shake. Suddenly, the script everyone memorized stops working. This is where the myth starts to crack. Walz has long been sold as the calm, sensible Midwestern adult in the room, the kind of politician who's supposed to balance empathy with practicality. The image is clean, friendly, reassuring, and, most importantly, non-threatening. But the problem with carefully polished images is that they only hold up when no one asks follow-up questions. Rogan and Kelly are professionally allergic to that. And once they started pulling on the loose threads, the sweater didn't just unravel, it practically fell apart on its own. At the center of it all was the widening gap between the image and the results. Walz presents himself as someone who understands regular people, a leader who listens, and a governor who leads with heart. But when the policies pile up and the outcomes start coming in, the numbers begin to feel off. Rogan and Kelly didn't need to stretch the truth at all.
And if this is such a made-up scandal that never happened, CNN, Why did Tim Walz just announce he's not running for governor again? I'll let you hear him explain it in part right here. This just happened.
I don't want to mince words here. Donald Trump and his allies in Washington and in St. Paul and online want to make our state a colder, meaner place. They want to poison our people against each other by attacking our neighbors. And ultimately, they want to take away much of what makes Minnesota the best place in the country.
They simply laid out the chain of decisions and let the audience notice how often the promised results showed up late or didn't show up at all. That's where the sarcasm almost writes itself, because somehow every problem becomes someone else's fault. Every failure gets reframed as a noble sacrifice, and every criticism is treated like a personal attack on basic decency. Rogan has a knack for spotting when a story leans on emotion instead of logic. And Kelly has spent years breaking down how political messaging hides behind tone rather than substance. Put them together, and suddenly Walz's carefully maintained image starts to feel less like leadership and more like a branding exercise. They questioned whether policies sold as compassionate were actually helping the people they claim to protect. That question alone is enough to make certain corners of the internet break out in hives. And here's where it gets darkly funny. The loudest offenders didn't show up with evidence or explanations. They showed up with vibes.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who was running for vice president.
I'd never seen this before. People driving by my house and using the R word in front of people. This is shameful.
They just passed something in Minnesota where illegal immigrants are allowed to have driver's licenses and vote, which is kind of crazy.
And I have yet to see an elected official, a Republican elected official, say, you're right, that's shameful.
A lot of the reason for wanting an open border is congressional seats.
So look, I'm worried. We know how these things go. They start with taunts, they turn to violence.
Because one of the things about when you do a census, it doesn't count how many people are citizens, it counts how many people. And so you can get extra congressional seats if you have more illegal immigrants in your city.
Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about results, data, or unintended consequences anymore. It became about tone, intention, and whether asking questions at all meant you were secretly the bad guy. That response said more than any statistic ever could. When criticism starts feeling off limits, it usually means someone is nervous about what happens if the discussion keeps going. Rogan's role in this whole dynamic is especially frustrating for establishment politics because he refuses to play by their rules. He doesn't perform neutrality in the polished, sanitized way they prefer, and he definitely doesn't act impressed by titles or status.
Okay, this is yet another problem for Minnesota and Tim Walz. This is not the daycare. This is yet another problem. Behavioral health and substance abuse centers, where the own Minnesota auditor is saying, and this is in the write-up of it, you fabricated documentation to try to satisfy my audit. You backdated documents. You came up with false justifications for spending that were bullshit. And this is all taxpayer money.
Rogan and Kelly didn't paint him as some unique villain. They presented him as a textbook example, and that's far more damaging. You can shrug off an outlier. A pattern is much harder to ignore. Eventually, the conversation drifted into the strange place where leaders are praised more for what they say than for what actually happens. Walz has perfected the language of concern, the words of empathy, and the rhythm of reassurance. But when those words collide with reality, the crash is loud, even without anyone yelling. Rogan and Kelly let that collision play out live, and the sound it made wasn't flattering. What came next online was both predictable and telling. That reaction shows just how fragile the story really is. There's a reason satire thrives in moments like this. When reality contradicts the script, humor becomes the sharpest tool in the room. Rogan's laid-back delivery made the critiques hit harder because they felt natural, and Kelly's exacting style made them stick because they left no room for wriggle.
Changed the Minnesota state flag to make it look like a Somali flag. You haven't seen that?
Donald Trump's calling our Somali neighbors garbage and the state of Minnesota a hellhole, I'm assuming is unprecedented for a United States president.
Minnesota has a huge population of Somalis in it.
We've got little children going to school today who their president called them garbage.
That stuff scares the fuck out of people.
Demonizing the entire group of people by their race and their ethnicity, a very group of people who contribute to the vitality, economic, cultural of this state, is something I was hoping we'd never have to see.
Together, they created a space where listeners could laugh and think at the same time, and that's exactly what makes political operatives uneasy. Walz, whether he means to or not, represents a political era that confuses good intentions with good results. That confusion rarely gets challenged head-on because it feels impolite, Rogan and Kelly ignored that rule. They treated policy like policy, not like a moral badge. And suddenly, the conversation felt risky again. Risky for narratives, reputations, and the idea that saying the right words is enough. The real irony? None of this needed exaggeration. As the script kept unraveling, it became clear that Walz's biggest problem wasn't Rogan or Kelly. It was the expectation that no one would ever connect the dots publicly. Politics survives on short memories and selective attention. A long-form conversation that refuses to rush is a nightmare. Once the audience starts thinking in sequences instead of sound bites, the illusion becomes far harder and more expensive to maintain.
It's amazing this guy was like within a breath of the vice presidency.
Which means you're a heartbeat away from the presidency.
Yeah, and let's not forget, this was the one decision Kamala Harris made on her gut, on gut instinct. That's what she said. She interviewed him and she just knew Tim Walz was right for the job. Oh my God. So here's the deal.
The conversation also showed just how insulated modern politicians have become from unscripted scrutiny. Walz is at ease in friendly settings where the questions are predictable and the applause comes right on cue. Rogan and Kelly brought something different. Not chaos, but curiosity. They didn't tell the audience what to think. They showed them how to notice. And that's far more subversive than outrage. At no point did it feel like a takedown. It felt like a slow realization. The kind that hits you halfway through a movie when you suddenly see who the real villain is. And it isn't the person you were told to watch. Critics kept replaying the moments when the mask slipped just enough to notice. Neutral viewers found themselves questioning assumptions they didn't even know they had. That's the quiet power of a carefully aimed conversation. It doesn't demand agreement. It invites reflection. The humor woven through it all wasn't about punchlines. It was the kind that sneaks up on you. Observations that make you laugh because they're uncomfortably true.
My favorites was that Tim Walz tried to claim that his wife got pregnant through in vitro fertilization, and she said that's not true. So he lied about that.
Some of you might have heard this. This is very personal for my wife and I. When Gwen and I decided to have children, we went through years of fertility treatments. And I remember each night praying that the call was going to come and it was going to be good news. The phone would ring, tenseness in my stomach, and then the agony when you heard the treatments hadn't worked.
The First Lady of Minnesota, Gwen Walz, revealed that she underwent a different fertility treatment, not
the idea that leadership is measured by applause instead of results. The notion that questioning policy is somehow cruel. The absurdity of insisting everything is fine while explaining why it's not, all in the same breath. Rogan and Kelly didn't declare themselves heroes or claim victory. They moved on, and somehow that made it feel even harsher. There was no grand finale, no dramatic mic drop, just the quiet sense that something important had been said and couldn't be taken back. Walz didn't lose an argument, he lost control of the story. And in modern politics, that's the real defeat. The funniest part? How avoidable it all was. Transparency can neutralize criticism before it grows teeth. Accountability can build trust instead of eroding it. But that only works if you accept that good intentions don't excuse bad results. And that's a lesson politics keeps forgetting, over and over again.
So I've decided to step out of this race, and I'll let others worry about the election while I focus on the work that's in front of me for the next year.
What is he going to turn into? Is he going to turn into Batman now? He's going to be a private citizen seeking out fraud and avenging wrongs. What's he even talking about?
Right. So he says, I can't devote any time away from focusing on the criminals who prey on our generosity. Now, literally, he was just calling those of us who are pointing at the Somali community within Minnesota.
The conversation didn't change the world overnight, and it didn't need to. It planted a small seed of doubt in a place where certainty had gone unchallenged for too long. Once that seed takes root, it grows quietly, fed by every headline, every policy update, and every moment when words don't quite match reality. That's why this moment mattered, not because of who said it, but because of how it was said. Calmly, humorously, and relentlessly curious. The kind of approach that doesn't demand attention but earns it. The kind that makes you laugh first, think second, and then wonder why no one pointed it out sooner. And that's the real punchline. Not that Walz was called out, but how little effort it took once someone stopped playing along. Once that sinks in, it's impossible to ignore how much politics depends on collective amnesia. The lingering discomfort comes from realizing how rare this kind of approach has become. Leaders are usually judged on how well they signal virtue, not whether their decisions actually create measurable results. When that standard is challenged, even gently, the reaction is defensive, because the whole system depends on nobody ever asking for receipts.
Insemination.
What a weird guy he was.
His wife had to come out and say he was lying. That guy lied about everything. He lied about being a head coach. He was an assistant coach. Lied about his military rank. Lied about whether or not he served in a war.
I criticized his lying about his own record, okay? This is a guy who was captured on video saying, I carried a gun in war. He never went to war.
Lied about whether or not he was in Tiananmen Square. Lies about everything.
Rogan's curiosity and Kelly's precision brought the focus back to actual results. And suddenly, the conversation felt dangerous again. Not because it was extreme, but because it was real. What made it land was how ordinary it seemed. No dramatic setups, no moral lectures, no push for listeners to pick a side right away. Just a steady stream of observations that quietly boxed the narrative in until it had nowhere left to hide. That's the kind of critique that sticks, because it doesn't tell you what to think. It makes you realize you've been outsourcing your thinking for a while. That curiosity is the real threat. Outrage flares up and dies quickly. Curiosity lingers. It turns into follow-up questions, comparisons, and those uncomfortable moments when people start noticing patterns instead of personalities.
So Tim Walz is out there trying to blame his I'm not going to run for re-election literally on Donald Trump and his meanness. And I'll play you the soundbite. He tried to pivot to January 6th as some sort of relevant thing when defending his decision. And it appears that there is fraud rampant in virtually every organization under Tim Walz's control, Mark.
He better hope that the investigative reporting bandwidth of the state is filled up with other things, because even though he's not running for election, he is.
Rogan and Kelly didn't invent that curiosity out of nowhere. They just gave it space to exist in a setting where it's usually discouraged. The irony? None of this needed hostility. It just needed honesty, consistency, and a refusal to treat leadership like a branding exercise. When those qualities appear, even briefly, the contrast is impossible to ignore. Walz wasn't exposed by insults or exaggeration. He was exposed simply by being near scrutiny, and that says more about the political environment than about him alone. Long after the clip stops circulating and the headlines fade, that uneasy feeling lingers. The sense that something obvious was hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to point it out without flinching. That's the kind of moment audiences remember, not because it was loud, but because it felt real. And once you see the gap between the story and the substance, it changes how you listen next time. Words sound different, reassurances feel thinner, and confidence seems a little too polished. That's the quiet aftermath of a conversation that didn't try to win, but somehow still landed.